It's one of the deepest honors of my life to be here and to honor my favorite professor of all time, Chuck Manoli. I mean, I really had a road to Damascus experience here at Saint Vincent College when I met Chuck. I was probably one of the worst high school students in the history of my high school. I had read one book in all of high school, and it was The Agony and the Ecstasy, and I was ashamed of the fact that I had read that. It just wasn't what you're supposed to do. And I came up here to St. Vincent's. I think I began majoring in management. I thought, well, I'll be a manager. Second semester was accounting. Third semester was English. And then I sat in on a Chuck Manoli class. And it's the Manoli method. I've been teaching a long time, and I've never been able to replicate it. I think I'm a good teacher. And I think I can teach, I can hold a classroom's interest and an audience interest. But what Chuck was able to do is almost inimitable. He sees education as a continuum, not just what happens in a classroom. And he got all of us reading, but not just reading the course material, not just cramming to study for exams. Guys like Joe and Jim and I, we weren't readers, and all of a sudden we're reading the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine section, this is Renee as well, the book review sections, or going to the, I used to skip classes to go to the library to read books, and I'd skip class because I didn't want anybody to know I was in the library. And that was Chuck Manoli, and he did it in a very quiet, completely unintimidating way, because if I'd been intimidated, I just would have turned off to it. I remember one instance, I told this at lunch, I did my first paper for Chuck, and it was miserable. My roommate thought it was great, but he was as dumb as I was. And I handed it in, and I got generously a D+. So for the first time in my life, I went in to see a professor to ask about, how I could get it up, get the grade up, do a little better. And I put it in front of Chuck, and he looked at it, and he said, this is pretty good. I said, what do you mean? He goes, look at this sentence. This is a very good sentence here. I said, yeah? What about the rest of the 77 sentences? He said, there's room for improvement. There really is. And I thought, well, that's encouraging. That's encouraging. I'm going to put this water over here, or I'll spill it. I just finished a book on, I've been working on for the last 5 years about New York City, the 1920s. A big sprawling book. It deals with sports, jazz, Broadway, the writing life, and things like that. But I'm talking today about a book I did 6 years ago called Masters of the Air. And it's come back into my life recently because I've been working over the last couple of years with Playtone, with Tom Hanks and Steve Spielberg. And I worked on a series called, I started with Band of Brothers, and I worked on a series called The Pacific, and then Tom and I did a movie, which will be on HBO shortly, called He Has Seen War, which is about veterans from 45 to the present. There's a big myth about these veterans, and Hanks and I were at an event one time, and this is where he got the inspiration for this, and a kid came up to him, I say a kid, about 25 years old. He was a captain, Marine captain in Afghanistan, and he said, a lot of my guys think that they're not as tough as the greatest generation. And he was speaking to Hanks. He said, the guys you featured in your film, Band of Brothers in the Pacific. And Tom said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, these guys are suffering from terrific traumatic injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder. And the idea that they have is that the generation that fought World War II didn't experience these sort of things. And Hank said, we got to do a film on this. And we did. We got all the veterans together and from Band of Brothers in the Pacific, and we got them to talk deeply about their experiences. And it was heart-wrenching. I mean, these guys went through almost exactly the same kind of experiences that kids are going through that are coming out of Iraq and out of Afghanistan. And so that was a special treat to work on that kind of thing. I got interested in warfare. I had never taken a course in military history in my life, in graduate school or as an undergraduate. I didn't do much reading in military history. I come from a family that was heavily involved in World War II. My dad was in the 8th Air Force, the unit I'm going to talk about today. My uncle flew in the Pacific in B-29s in the firebombing campaign against Japan. I had another uncle that was with the 1st Division, the big red one, that fought in North Africa and then Sicily, and then he was first on the beaches at Normandy, fought in the Battle of Bulge, became a prisoner, and then later was liberated. So we came from that kind of family, and I remember the Memorial Day parades in Reading, Pennsylvania, my hometown, and we'd sit proudly on the front porch and watch guys from the Catholic War veterans march up to the grave and give the 16-gun salutes and the whole thing. My dad was president of the Catholic War veterans, so the war was a living experience for me. We loved to crawl up in the attic, my brother and I, and look through the old war chests, and see the German Lugers and the Air Force jackets. And I'd watch my mom put out the wash on Monday. That was always wash day, And we lived in veterans housing after the war, and all the women were there with their bomber jackets on, hanging up the wash. I remember going to see 12 O'Clock High with my dad and saying, "Did that really happen?" He said, "Yeah, it kind of did, Kind of did. It was pretty bad." But what turned me on to warfare studies, I guess, was the death of my father in 1995. That's when I turned. My granddaughter actually said to me, "You've written all these books about," she was 6 years old, "You've written all these books, but you haven't written about Pop-Pop." And I thought, yeah, maybe I ought to do that. So I kind of crawled into it. I did a general history of World War II, and then I did a book on the Pacific, and then I finally came around to writing about this unit, the 8th Air Force. Well, it was the human element that really grabbed me about warfare. Like a lot of people, I was an athlete, and we were always taught that, your character shows on the athletic field. You can really tell, what a person's made of there. And we use all these junky kind of analogies with warfare, that, life is like warfare, and we have blitzes and things like that. Well, it isn't anything like warfare. The way veterans, any veteran can tell you that. And what I'm interested in is war as a revealer of character. The national character, the way countries fight a war is deeply reflective of the kind of culture that country harbors. The way human beings hold up or don't hold up in war is a reflection of who they are. Your doctor tells you stress kills. It does, and the side that applies the most stress in warfare wins, and stress is a tremendous revealer of character as well. So, not that we should have wars, to see who we are, or we need them to see who we are, but it has that dimension. And war is, as you know, culturally transformative. I don't think we should ever have a war again, and nobody would want one. And most of the veterans I talk to say that the one lesson you want to teach people is that, the last war should be the last war. But without the revolution, we're not a country. Without the Civil War, we have slavery for another 30 years. Without World War II, we have fascism for maybe another 40 years. So sometimes they're necessary. And World War II was that. It wasn't a great war, but it was a necessary war. And the human cost was immeasurable. We're still counting the numbers. Now, the Russian archives are now open, and we can get in there, and Russian scholars are telling us now that 27 million Russians died in World War II. That's civilians and soldiers. America lost 402,000 total soldiers in World War II. The total number used to be 50 million, now it's up to 65, and it could be 70 million by the time people really get the count in from countries like Yugoslavia and Poland, which per capita suffered the most during World War II. So it's an immensely destructive experience. It's also one of the most transformative experiences of the 20th century and one of the greatest stories of the 20th century. It's no wonder so many movies and books have been written about it. The part of the war that I'm going to talk about today is like a war within a war. It's this tremendous bomber campaign, and we'll never have another one. We never had one before this, and we'll never have another one after it because of rocketry and missiles and things like that. But it's this tremendous bomber campaign that the British and the Americans, the only two countries in the entire war who had big four-engine bombers, capable of flying long distances and carrying heavy bomb loads. And it's about a campaign, this book, that they launched. The British began it in 1940, and it continued to the end of the war. against Nazi Germany, against the entire Reich, if you will. And it is the longest military campaign of the war. And think of this. These guys, these bomber pilots, were the first ones to take the war on the Allied side directly to Hitler's doorstep. The first American soldier doesn't step across the Rhine on the Heimat, on German soil, until March of 1945, late March 45. And there's only about a month left of the entire war. And yet the American 8th Air Force is flying over Germany beginning in August 1942. If you reel up in time to late 1943, 89% of the prisoners in German stalags, German prison camps, 89% were British and American flyers. So and they delivered a lot of punishment to Germany. We'll talk more about how effective the bombing was a little later, but they delivered a lot of punishment. It's hard to estimate body counts, but about 600,000 German civilians were killed by Allied bombs in World War II. 60,000 Brits were killed by German bombs in World War II. What gets you, too, is that there are two sets of victims in this war, those who were under the bombs and those who delivered the bombs. Now, if you look at those who delivered the bombs, independent of the trauma of flying over heavily defended German cities, there's the casualty figures. When I first started working on a book, I was awestruck by this. British Bomber Command, which flew these big Lancaster bombers against Germany's, they had 110,000 guys fly in World War II, 110,000, and 55,000 were killed. So 1 in 2 chance of surviving. The American 8th Air Force flew a shorter campaign, 3 years. They had 26,000 killed and well over 100,000 casualties. Now, let's take that number, 26,000. That's more Marines and Army personnel. Let's just take the Marines for a second. That's more Marines than were killed in the entire Pacific War. From Guadalcanal, through Tarawa, through Gloucester, through Iwo Jima, to Okinawa, and right to the doorstep of Japan. 19,000 Marines died. A small unit in England, 26,000 dead. And 28,000 were made prisoners of war. 77% of the guys who flew with the 8th Air Force were casualties in World War II. You had about a 1 in 4 chance of surviving. Harrison Salisbury, the New York Times, said to fly with the 8th Air Force is to hold a ticket to a funeral, your own. So these staggering figures just make you want to shake your head. And as our writer for this film series said, John Scheiban, John keeps saying, how in the hell did they get in the planes after flying these kinds of missions and knowing the odds were so staggeringly against them? And, I was just interviewing veterans for our film down in Savannah to get more stories. And I don't know. One guy I was interviewing was in the front of the plane, in the plexiglass nose of the plane, and he was hit with a burst of flak, German anti-aircraft shrapnel. And it went right through his eye. So he's blinded in one eye, and he loses part of his jaw and part of his shoulder. And he's the bombardier in the plane, and sitting next to him in the cone of the plane is a navigator. The navigator's dead. So he crawls up to the cockpit, just pilot, co-pilot, where the first aid kits are. Pilot's barely surviving and just holding on. Co-pilot's dead. They say the first aid kit's in the radio room. They go in the radio room, or the radio operator, that's what my dad used to do. The radio operator, he's dead too. At that point, the pilot passes out, and the plane goes into a cloud bank and flips. And because of the G-forces and the physics of this, you're in space. You might as well be in a space movie. They started to float in the air. The dead body of the radio man and this guy, and they floated like that for 6 minutes before the plane righted itself, and miraculously, they got back to England. And you hear these stories, and again, you keep asking that question, how did they do it? But as one guy said, it almost would have been harder not to do it because of the peer pressure especially, and the pressure from your fellow airmen not wanting to let them down. And see, it's one of the secrets of warfare. You can't have warfare without love, the kind of love that men feel for each other. That keeps them together under stresses, whether it's in a U-boat or in a plane or in a foxhole. And I think that, and leadership, is what really keeps these guys together in this kind of war. And what's interesting about the war that I dealt with is, and so much of this was new to me, although I'd written about combat before, this is a really revolutionary kind of warfare they're fighting. I mean, we had an air war, a bit of one in World War I, but that was fought at 9,000 feet. And with small fighter planes, occasionally a bomber here or there. But this is the first time that human beings, men, had fought at 20 and 30,000 feet in the sky. The first time that human beings had flown at 20 or 30,000 feet high. 87% of the guys who flew with the 8th Air Force had never been in a plane before they joined the service. Okay? They might have seen a plane, they might have heard Lindbergh on the radio, they knew of him, they might have built a model airplane, but very few had ever been in a plane. So everything's entirely new. And what makes it so different, this kind of warfare, as a historian, when you look at it, is I can go to Gettysburg, and I can reenact the battle in my own mind. I can see that wall up there that the Union is behind, and up on Cemetery Ridge, and I can go down where the rebels were, and I can say, well, maybe Lee was crazy, maybe this was a suicidal charge, maybe this was too much to ask of human beings. But I can't go and revisit an air battle. I mean, if you consider one of these air battles, take a year, 1944, the British were flying at night, and they were flying about 600 planes in formation against Germany, with maybe 400 fighter planes. And as soon as they came back to England, imagine living in England, the whole ground would shake when these planes would come over. No sooner were they back than the Air Force, the 8th Air Force, would take off about 6 in the morning. And their missions were 1,000 bomber raids, 1,200, 1,300 bombers, and maybe 1,000 fighter planes. How long is that? Well, if you go off the coast of England, and this bomber train would extend all the way across Amsterdam to the coast of England. That's how far back it would go. And he went straight into the heart of the Reich. They flew 997 of these missions, and none of them were ever turned back. And that's another thing, in traditional warfare, a general can direct the battle, and when things are going badly, he can move troops over here, a Patton or a Lee or someone like that, or let's retreat, let's pull back, let's reconsider. You can't do that in the air war because you're flying on radio silence. You got 10 guys in the plane, maybe the oldest guy's 23, and there are no generals in the sky to direct the battle. So I don't think ever in the history of warfare so much responsibility, whether they lived or died, whether Germans lived or died, how many Germans lived or died. I don't think any unit in warfare had as much stress put on them as these, at such a young age as these bomber crews. As one guy said to it, he said, I kept thinking when I was flying over the channel that I should be at Syracuse. This is my junior year. I should be getting ready for my second American history course. I don't want to be here, but I am. So it's a strange, really strange kind of warfare. I mean, here it is, the air, we breathe it. It's life-giving, but the air over 12,000 feet kills. You can't breathe it, it's too thin. So the guys are on oxygen. And if an oxygen mask, and the planes aren't pressurized, they're open to the air. The waist gunners, or wall gunners as they were called on the plane, shot their 50 caliber Browning machine guns. They shot them out of open portals. The top of the plane, over the radio room, was wide open to the winds. And it's cold. As one airman said, all I kept thinking of was how cold it was up there. How goddamn cold it was. 60 degrees below zero inside the plane over Germany. So you get frostbite. And lots of guys broke down from frostbite. The Air Force hadn't thought of any of this stuff. They thought about how to bomb. They didn't think about what would happen to the guys inside the plane. One of the guys I interviewed in Savannah said when he was coming home, he was on a troop ship, and he went down to visit some of the guys who were really banged up pretty badly. And this one guy he saw had lost both his eyes, both his ears. He lost part of his jaw, all his fingers, and all his feet, all through frostbite. So it was the most grotesque thing he'd ever seen. And nobody thought of that when we first went into this sort of thing. The other thing that's new about it is, too, the sun. I mean, the sun, we depend on the sun for life. But on a sunny day, that's a bad day for a bomber because the Germans can see you, okay? And sighting and seeing you means killing you. So air, sun, the things we depend upon for life. And these guys are also, it's a strange kind of thing. There's this tremendous, might be a tremendous air battle in the sky, like there's a tremendous ground battle at Gettysburg. And then it's all over. And as I was saying earlier, you can't go back to the battlefield. There is no battlefield. Maybe 800 guys died in that space in the sky. But who knows about the battles? We know about Iwo Jima, we know about the Bulge, we know about Gettysburg, but it's hard to reconstruct these air battles. And the other thing that was unnerving for a lot of the guys is there were very few corpses. And so there's no closure. Occasionally a guy would die in the plane. A couple guys could die in a plane in the accident I described. But generally when a plane went down, it went all the way down, or it exploded in the air. And you just saw your comrades just blown into particles in the sky. What was your closure? You went back to the base. If they happened to be in the barracks or Nissan hut that you were in, you went in there and there were empty barracks. As soon as the home command knew what bombers went down, even before the bombers returned, they stripped the beds. They took all your belongings, they put them in cases, and they sent them home. So the men came home to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 empty beds. Or maybe the next day you wake up and there's a softball game on base and you don't have your second baseman, right fielder, and center fielder. And there's no closure. And guys don't talk about that. My father said the first time he saw a corpse, he was running hitchhiking to go into town, into this little town called Norwich, which is above, all these bomber bases are in a place called East Anglia in eastern England. And Norwich is a cathedral town near there. So he's going into Norwich for a dance. And he was hitchhiking, and an ambulance, what looked like an ambulance, picked him up. She started running after the ambulance when it stopped. And he started to get in the back, open the back doors. It's a panel truck. And the guy said, no. And he opens it up, and there's 4 fish white corpses. I had never seen a corpse before. Guys didn't see corpses on bases. You just didn't see that sort of stuff. And I guess, one of the other things about it that was unsettling was it's a very different type of combat. It's intermittent. And you could be, and you're flying also, in addition to being intermittent, that is, you're not fighting continuously. You fight a land battle like the Battle of Bulge, it's 60 days straight of combat. And most guys never make it through 60 days. The average soldier in combat made it through 38 days. By that time, they're worn out, they're done, and they have to take them off the line if they're alive. And actually, 96% of the guys never made it to 38 days. They were dead before then on the ground. But in the air, you fly on a Tuesday, and then you might be ready to fly on a Wednesday, actually out on the tarmac with all your equipment on, oxygen mask, all ready to go, everything's ready to go. And it's a washout because of the weather. Terrible weather. It's island weather in England. And then you have to worry about weather over the target as well. So you get up in the morning, you think, is it my turn to die today? Well, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. Maybe we're going to fly and maybe we don't. And these guys counted because they had to fly 25 missions and they were done. Later it was extended to 30, then 35, but 25 was your way out. So they all did the odds on this. But sometimes I think that intermittent warfare was more taxing on the nerves, too. And there's also a strange kind of war, too, because a combat soldier's in the mud. He lives like a rodent. And it's a horrible life. The food's horrible, the conditions are horrible, and it's incessant. There's no shelter most of the time. These guys came back, the Air Force guys, to clean sheets. They had a nice officers' club. There were women in the villages there, and there was London. And yet, so a guy could be flying over Germany, fighting for his life at noon, and be with a girl of his dreams in London at 8 o'clock at night. Now you think, that's wonderful, or better than combat, but then you think you're getting in that capsule, it's fully loaded with gas, you're an easy target, and there are no foxholes in the sky. Nor are there, as these air guys keep reminding me, medics. You're hitting the plane, it's different than being hit in the ground. hitting the ground, you call for the corpsman or the medic. Well, you can't do that in the plane. All you can hope for is your comrades. They all carried morphine. They had just rudimentary kind of medical training, maybe a couple hours of it. They stick a vial of morphine, put a needle in the guy, and hope, put him on the cold floor of the plane, put a cover over him, a blanket over him, and hope he survives on the way back. And so everything about, air warfare is not worse than combat on the ground. Combat on the ground is not worse than air warfare. They're both equally worse, but they're hugely, hugely different kinds of experiences. And so this is I took this down. This is a transcript from an interview we just did with a guy. And it sounds like the guy's name was Ben Smith. It sounds like he wrote it. And he describes, and I'll finish this unnerving stuff in a second, but one of the most unnerving things about these bomb runs is you had to fly directly into German anti-aircraft fire. Now, the fighters were there also, and they hit you first. But then you entered a thing called the flak field, where German 88 guns would fire, and they had a range in the sky. They could get up to 30,000 feet. And there's bursting shrapnel. So there's clouds all in front of you. And the flak was often so thick, the guy said you could literally almost get out and walk on it. And so you're in the front of the plane, and you're the bombardier, and this flak's all there. And one burst can go right through there and take your face off. And you got to stay steady and bomb the target. You can't take evasive action. The plane can't try to avoid the flak, jumping here, jumping there, like a fighter plane could. You had to fly here to have a level platform from which to bomb. And all the guys could do, the gunners, in a B-29, that's the typical plane that fought, the 8th Air Force Air War, and the other was the B-24 Liberator. Both big 4-engine bombers, 10-person crews, 4 officers, 6 non-commissioned officers. 12 guns, looks like a formidable thing, a B-17. But the B-17 becomes just a target over the flak field because the gunners can't fire. And, Freud said that's the worst kind of helplessness. It's like if someone came into your house, strapped you to a chair, put some tape over your mouth and sat in front of you with a shotgun, some psychopath, and said, I might kill you or I might not. So it's entirely up to Lady Fortune whether you survive or not. And when you're in the flak field, the guys would get so unnerved, they'd fire their guns at the flak. They couldn't do anything but sit there and take it. And that was really tough. This is one guy from our interview. He says, over the oil plant, they were bombing a synthetic oil plant. He said, the sky looks like some kind of painting, some kind of surrealist painting by Hieronymus Bosch. He said there was a pall of smoke as thick as a forest fire, long plumes of smoke. Planes were just, inundated with it, bombers and fighters alike. He said parachutes dotted the landscape like random wildflowers. I can't believe this guy's telling me this. And then he said to himself, what I kept wondering is, I saw a guy, he said, fall out of a plane without his parachute. And he fell right in front of us. He said to me, what happens to your body when you fall 25,000 feet? He said, do you die on the way down? Are you conscious all the way, screaming? Or does it happen when you hit? And guys wondered this. They wondered this. And sometimes, in heavy battles, lots of times, guys broke down in the plane and later. And they usually broke down not the way combat veterans do on the ground with that 20-mile stare and things like that, and you go into a kind of a torpor. You'd get phobias. People have phobias about, some people are afraid of heights, and some people are afraid of mice, and the phobias you'd get were usually related to the kind of accident you were in that triggered your phobia. I'll give you a typical example. Sherman Small, he's still an active businessman, 91 years old in Connecticut. And Sherman was a tail gunner on a B-17, back there all by himself, sitting on a little bicycle seat with a machine gun. And a German fighter plane crashed into them deliberately and cut the plane in two. So he's falling from 25,000 feet in the tail of the plane. And he can't get to, he has a parachute, but he can't get out of the plane. And you can't punch. The planes, the skin of the plane is aluminum. It's not that thick. You can drive through it with a screwdriver, but not with a fist. He went all the way down and lived. How in the world that happened, he doesn't know, no one knows, but he lived. That was a Monday. The next day, he was flying again. In the tail. Put him right back up again. And he said he doesn't remember, but they told him that they took him off that plane like a frozen Wisconsin log. He was just frozen up like that. And they took him to an Air Force hospital. And this is how they treated the guy. They gave him things called Blue 88s. Those were named after the German guns, and they had such a powerful effect. It's a little pill. It's called sodium amytal and sometimes sodium pentothal. It's like it creates a dreamlike state of sleep. You're semi-awake. And when you're under sodium pentothal, you can be interrogated. And they would get these psychologists, when these guys were out like this, to try to get the human beings that were so mangled mentally to talk about their experiences. And they'd start screaming at them. Fighters at 12 o'clock high. Your buddy's arm just blew off. And the guys would start screaming and writhing and things like that. And that was supposed to cure them. I mean, after the war, the final verdict of the American 8th Air Force psychiatrists after the war was this: the only way to get rid of this thing is to tell them one thing: you'll never have to fly again. Cured. But they'd give you this, and then you'd rest 2 days. Maybe they'd then send you to a rest home for a week, where you'd ride horseback, shoot skeet, things like that, wear civilian clothes. And then you go back into battle, back into the very situation that put you in the hospital in the first place. And so this is how you survive the war. And Sherman said when he went back in the plane, he said, you know how I survived? He said, I pretended I was in a movie. And I was Clark Gable. I wasn't Sherman Small, and they weren't Nazis out there. They were just actors. He said, it worked for the whole war. And when the interview was over, I went to lunch with him, and I said, Sherman, what happened after the war? He said, I went nuts. They sent me to a hospital in Florida, and I was there for 4 years with electroshock treatments. It all came back to him. Now, so people paid, both under the bombs as well as I'm saying here today. I have lots of chapters in the book about what it was like to be under the bombs in Germany, and that was unbelievable. But we're just focusing on this right now. Now, did this kind of bombing work? Well, I think one of the great myths of the war is that it didn't, that Germany was still producing a lot of fighters, almost as many at the end of the war as they were at the beginning of the war. They were still producing fighters at underground factories that couldn't be bombed, for example, in forest factories that couldn't be seen. But they had lost most of their pilots, and especially their veteran pilots. And without a Luftwaffe, a German Air Force, the German army is utterly helpless. The bombing in the beginning of the war was abysmally ineffective. See, the theory was great. What the Americans were going to do is what the British tried and failed at. When the Americans got there in August of 1942, the British had been flying for some time, and they tried to bomb Germany in daylight. And they got hammered. They took calamitous losses, and they weren't hitting targets very well because the guys were so unnerved in the planes. So they started flying at night, and since they couldn't see the target, they just bombed entire cities. They marked them out for slaughter. They immolated them. Cities like Forsdam and Dresden and things like that. This is firebombing, carpet bombing. The American Air Force is going to do it different, cleaner, so to speak. They're going to try to bomb strategically, just hit tank factories, just hit munitions factories. And they thought they could do it, and there's a lot of hubris involved in this. They thought they could do it because they had a thing called the Norden bomb site, which is with the atomic bomb, it's probably the second most important secret weapon of the war. It had to be guarded at all times. This is a site that the bombardier looked through. It's a mini computer. And with this Norden bomb site, in clear weather, flying in training in a desert in Nevada, you could hit sand targets at 20,000 feet pretty accurately. You could really do that. And so accurately that they called it pickle barrel bombing, claiming that you could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. Well, actually, pinpoint bombing's an oxymoron. It just never worked. And, but the idea was that we're going to fly high over Germany, higher than the British did, above the flak, and then we're going to bomb through the clouds, through the spaces in the clouds with this Norden bomb sight, just hit factories, not kill civilians. And because we're flying so high, and we're flying in formations called combat boxes, remember, each plane with 12 guns, put 20 of these planes together, that's too formidable for the German Air Force. Well, that's paper warfare, gang. Everything broke down with paper warfare once the war started. They couldn't fly over the top of the flak. The fighters were much more aggressive and much more numerous than they thought. The Norden bomb sight, imagine sitting at Norden bomb sight when you're bouncing like that through the flak and trying to get a beam on the target. And anybody who's been to Europe knows it's cloudy almost 190 days of the year. You can't see through the clouds, so you have to bomb by radar. So you're really doing carpet bombing. And even then, we're bombing submarine pens because we're worried about this Battle of the Atlantic. They're destroying the economic lifeline, the Nazis are, between America and England, and all the gas that's going over from America. By the way, America produced 92% of the oil in the world in 1944. 92%. We were an energy colossus. Germany produced 3%. So we're worried about that economic life. I knock out the U-boats, but the U-boats are in these pens. A pen's like if you take a shoebox, you turn the shoebox over. Okay, you open it up and you turn it over, and you cut a little opening in it, like the door of the little playhouse you used to make when you were a kid. Well, the sub would go in there, and then it would go down 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9 levels and be repaired down there. And over the top of the shoebox, it's concrete, 8 feet thick. So our bombs are bouncing off these U-boat pens like ping pong balls. And this is what's called the 12 o'clock high phase of the air war. That's from the Gregory Peck film. And there, the objective for commanders is how do you get guys to get in the planes when they know they're going to take losses and know their bombing's ineffective? That's a lesson in leadership, how that goes on. So in the beginning, we're also not getting enough bombers over Germany. We don't have the productive capacity yet. But when we gear up, and when America gets a new plane called a P-51 Mustang, I don't want to get too technical here, but it's a fighter plane that's faster than anything the Germans have except the jets that they have. And thank God they had them in very limited quantity, or they'd have won the air war. This Mustang could fly fast, but it had long legs. It could fly all the way with extra fuel tanks to Berlin. It could fly as long as the bombers did. See, the early bombers would go into Germany, and the fighter planes would peel off. They didn't have range. So these guys had to go to the target unescorted, and they get creamed. But now they could go to the target escorted by these Mustangs, 600, 700 of them. And now the commanders told them, here's what you have to do. You got to go in there, the bomber pilots, and act as bait to draw up the Luftwaffe. And when we draw them up, we'll slaughter them with the Mustangs. And the guys kind of knew they were bait. But it was considered essential. Why was it considered essential? Because all this is happening after Christmas 1943. And Eisenhower, on Christmas week, arrives in England as Supreme Commander of the Allied Invasion Force, the greatest invasion force in the history of the world. The invasion is scheduled for late May or June. Eisenhower tells his commanders, no invasion unless you clear the skies of the German Air Force. We will get slaughtered in the Channel if the Luftwaffe is there. Okay? The U-boats had already been knocked out the preceding May, but we got to deal with those guys. And in fact, I was standing at Normandy with Tom Brokaw and Steve Ambrose one time, and Steve was explaining the battle to Tom, and looking over Omaha Beach and stuff. And I said, Tom, the big thing with this thing is who wasn't here on D-Day. Thank God the U-boats weren't here, and thank God the German Air Force wasn't here, or this thing wouldn't have happened. But so with the Mustangs, though, just in the nick of time, they arrive in January of 45. They fight the Allies fight these tremendous air battles, and they attrit the German Air Force. They kill all the best German pilots, and by D-Day, the skies are cleared over the beaches. And it made the invasion possible. And once that happens, now all you have to worry about, like I say, ironically all, is the flak field. But now they go after synthetic oil plants. The German had a chemical process called Bergius that created synthetic oil. We're going to bomb oil, and we're going to bomb trains that carry coal. Forget bombing the mills and things like that. They can't exist without the coal. And the coal trains gather in marshalling yards. We'll hit the marshalling yards. Well, marshalling yards are in cities, right in the middle of it. So we're creaming German civilians while we're doing it. But it is effective. That's one of the moral dilemmas. Do you do it or you don't do it? And we can look back, and it's very simplistic to be in a morals class, a philosophy class in high school, and hear this kind of bullshit. You know, like, oh, you can't bomb civilians in warfare. But, well, okay. Then the war is prolonged, and more Americans die, and more British die, and more British die from rockets and things like that. It's just, these are hard decisions to make. You have to do history right. You have to see it, see. A lot of times, the past distorts. Everyone says the past gives you perspective. If your history teacher ever tells you that, he's wrong. The past doesn't give you perspective. You have to go back and see the action as the person who is living it acts, the decisions in front of him. Then you can make judgments when you see what the alternatives are. So easy morality is not something I'm too keen on. But anyway, they bombed these oil plants, they bombed these marshalling yards, and it was effective. War is about movement. The Germans can't move. They don't have any gas, okay. War is about firepower. They don't have any firepower. Their factories are down. And the Germans, like the Japanese, literally ran out of gas. They couldn't push the war much further. They fought it, for example, like crazy, the Japanese crazily fought it 5 months after they were defeated. And that was the thing in World War II. We're fighting two enemies who didn't give up. This isn't like World War I where there's a surrender. No surrender. There's no armistice. You have to really walk over Germany in order to get them to surrender and have the Fuhrer blow his brains out. So that's what happens with total warfare. To defeat the enemy, you have to totally destroy the enemy. Okay, every fiber in the enemy, even his will to resist. So bombing does that. And I think it did something else. It doesn't, and this is not, I'm not an advocate of bombing, who the hell could be? But what it did is, Margaret Gellhorn and a lot of reporters who went into Germany said this, there was no remorse. All she heard from Germans was, maybe the Fuhrer got us in the war too early. We should have joined later when we were better armed, okay? That's the kind of stuff she was hearing. Or, there were no Jews in my village. That's another one she heard all the time. But what she did see is that there was no allegiance to the Fuhrer anymore because he couldn't protect him. There's no allegiance to the Nazi Party because the party couldn't protect him. I interviewed a woman in Saxony near Dresden, and she said, when I gave up? When I threw the picture of the Fuhrer out of my window? She said, when your Air Force flew over my village like they were flying over Nebraska. No camouflage, the planes are all silver now, they're not brown or anything. And it took 15 minutes for them to get over my village. And where, earlier in the war, that fat cocaine-driven Goering, is saying to his people that never will a bomb drop on Berlin. Well, he couldn't do it. Goering's not there. The Fuhrer's not there. And I think in breaking that allegiance to the party, it's a first step in the German democratization movement. Not that you want bombing to be the thing that does that, but often it does. But in conclusions, go back to the men. I like to go back to Normandy. I just was there recently, and I'm going back again in May, and with a gang of veterans. And I think one of the most powerful experiences that I've ever had is walking through the Omaha Cemetery there, the Omaha Beach Cemetery. I'm sure a lot of you have been there. And it is deeply, deeply powerful. But I just wish that somewhere on that beach, where we lost 4,400 Americans, I just wish somewhere on that beach there was one little monument to the 8th Air Force, who lost 20,000 guys in the 4-month buildup that made that invasion possible. Thank you.